Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give it another couple of seconds or so, and then we will kick off our session this morning. Thank you. Apologies, I don't think you could hear me there a moment ago, so I will kick off again. Good morning and welcome everyone to this Morgan Hunt webinar on addressing the ongoing motherhood penalty, where we'll explore the impact of the motherhood penalty and how organizations and leaders can very much create an inclusive culture for working mums in the workplace. On average, it takes over a decade for a working mum career, working mother's career to recover to pre-children levels due to various factors, from limited access to senior roles to high cost of childcare. So the motherhood penalty is still very much a persistent issue that impacts women's careers long after they have had children. And that's what we're going to explore this morning. My name is Claire Canary, and I'm a director at Morgan Hunt, and I also lead on HR and well-being within our business. And for those of you not familiar with us, Morgan Hunt is an award-winning national recruitment business with over 150 expert recruiters across the UK in Glasgow, Manchester, Birmingham, and in London. We were established over 30 years ago, and Morgan Hunt provides specialist recruitment services to thousands of organisations across the public and private sector, working with placing thousands of working mothers every day. This promises to be a really interesting session, and I'm really delighted to be joined by two subject matter experts. And firstly, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Willits. Welcome, Liz, to our session this morning. Liz is the founder of Investing in Women, a flexible working job board and recruitment company, and a community helping thousands of professionals to land flexible jobs and supporting over 250 employers hiring diverse talent. Elizabeth has over 18 years recruitment experience herself, and she set up Investing in Women after being made redundant in 2020. And she is a passionate advocate for closing the gender pay gap through flexible work. And welcome also to Dr. Emma Harvey, who is a data analyst, scientist, educator, and co-founder of the 5 Hour Club, a pioneering initiative reimagining the 9-to-5 workday to help parents maintain their careers without sacrificing family life. Passionate about tackling the motherhood penalty, gender pay gap, and the loss of women, especially in STEM, through the 5 Hour Club, she works with forward-thinking employers to implement 5-hour workdays, unlocking highly skilled and often overlooked talent pools. So before we start our session this morning, just a few pointers on our format. We will finish at about 10:30, and that will give us about 45 to 50 minutes for our main conversation. However, I will leave about 10 to 15 minutes, or I'll aim to, at the end for questions from you, the audience. So please, if you have any questions at all, at any point in our conversation today, please post those on the YouTube chat. I will see them and I'll endeavour to answer as many as possible. So I thought to kick off our conversation, I would set the scene and talk about some of the maybe more depressing statistics. But women account for 30% of all managerial roles, 4% of CEO positions in the UK, 85% of women leave full-time employment within 3 years of having children, and almost a fifth exit work completely. And that is from a 2023 report, Careers After Babies, The Uncomfortable Truth. And that estimates that it takes women's careers over 10 years to recover to get back to the same seniority as they were pre-children. So I'll kick off with you, Liz, if I may. Does this resonate with you in terms of the conversations you're having every day with working mums?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I obviously hear it every day from people that are, being forced to leave the workplace for lots of different reasons. Predominantly for flexibility because they've had maybe their flexible working request rejected, or they have been forced to go back to the office full time. Maybe they've set up a life where they're expecting to be working on more of a hybrid basis. So I do get a lot of those messages, particularly when a big employer, says everyone's back to the office full time. A lot of people can't make, the sums add up when they take into consideration childcare, which we know, even with the free 30 hours per week, it's not actually every week, it's, term time only, and there are so many top-up costs, etc. On top of that. So a lot of women do feel forced, I think, to choose between family and career, and they really sort of struggle with that choice and feeling unsupported at work as well. So I think that's another thing when people go back, they, feel quite lost and unsupported. And, speaking from my experience when I went back after maternity leave, it sort of feels like you're starting a completely new job, but without any of that support as well. So I think people feel really lost. And I think there's a real danger zone. People do go back to work in that 6 months post return if they're not supported at work as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Liz. And what about you, Emma? Does that resonate, the conversations you guys are having?
Absolutely. I mean, this is where 5 Hour Club came about. It was sharing our stories and sharing our struggles to return to the workplace after having a gap. It was sharing our stories, that I deleted my PhD off my CV because I couldn't find that part-time role. That we hear so many stories of women changing career, taking pay cuts that are more than a half of their salaries, taking skills that are massively beneath what they're qualified for, they're overqualified, and the research matches that, and being driven out of the workforce. And I think it's hard to even choose just one story because the really scary thing is the magnitude and the scale of the problem. And I think that's the most worrying and concerning thing. And what I really want everyone to take home today is this huge gap that we're going to talk about, and that drives the motherhood penalty. But it is the normalization. These are the conversations that we are having on the school run. These are our friends and our family who are setting up their own businesses. It is not an easy option to do, but when we have a look at the numbers, it obviously makes sense as to why this is. So why is this not being plastered across every single headline in the newspapers? Why are we now having that conversation about the return to work office mandates that is going to impact on mothers and the female workforce? But what is having a larger impact is actually the motherhood penalty and the lack of flexible options. And we know that it is a global systemic issue. And honestly, it's thousands of stories and situations, and that it is normal.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. And Liz, in your experience, what do you see as the kind of key contributing factors to this penalty that working mums are clearly experiencing?
Oh, it's obviously so many, and I know
So
Emma's
many. Yeah.
touched on them, but obviously a lack of flexible working. And, we know that women still, even in heterosexual couples where the woman is earning more than their male partner, they still do the majority of childcare, housework, etc. And that's in those couples, but statistically, men do earn more than women, and so that's contributes to the gender pay gap. But women are much more likely to then take on childcare, a heavier domestic load at home. They're much more likely, therefore, to want or need flexible working. But only 12% of roles advertised mention flexible or part-time work. And often these roles are much lower paid, they're lower skilled. It forces women into lower paid roles. I did a podcast interview with a brilliant high flyer who did a flexible working request after maternity leave was told, yes, she could have it, but if she came back at the grade below, which she did. But this, like Emma said, is not an isolated story. This happens repeatedly where, ambitious, clever professional women are forced into roles way below their skill set and salary. So they're taking pay cuts to get that flexibility. Obviously, the UK has one of the highest childcare costs in the world, which forces a lot of women into flexible work, even if they don't want to do it. There's a massive stigma as well around part-time work, that those individuals are less committed. And there is, a mummy track as well. A lot of people end up on a mummy track if they work part-time. They're not, they're often overlooked for promotions. And there's biased assumptions that women are less ambitious, they're less available. But I saw actually a LinkedIn post by women, I think it was Women in Data, only at the weekend, that said actually 3/4 of working mothers reported being more ambitious, not less, after having children. And I think the workplace structure, unfortunately, in a lot of places it had got more flexible, but actually in some places it's rolling back. And that 9 to 5 was set up in a time when there actually was somebody supporting at home, and it's just impossible, to do. Often people find it's impossible to just do it all, and something has to
Yeah.
give.
Thank you, Liz. And from your perspective, Emma, what else do you see as those key drivers for these awful stats?
So when you talk about those stats, really what we're looking at is the cause and effect. You're looking at the effect in terms of the gender pay gap. So if I first of all talk about the effect, and then I'll talk about the cause. So first of all, if we talk about the effect, and when you said about women recovering 10 years after after childbirth, that's not necessarily even the case. If you have a look, there's this very, this graph that I'm sure many of you've seen, and it has a graph of mothers and fathers. And when you have a child, essentially the father's pay pretty much stays the same, and the mother's pay has a massive dip, a slight increase, and stays the same for the rest of her career. Now, that's just in terms of salary, okay? And we can talk about various different aspects of the motherhood penalty. So I first of all wanted to say, so if we think about Claudia Goldin, so she was a Nobel Prize winner for economics in 2023. And she looked at gender differences in earnings and how employment rate change over time. And she said that Parental can almost entirely explain the income differences between men and women in high income countries. So when we look at the motherhood penalty, when we look at when parents become parents and then go back to the workforce, we are looking at the gender pay gap, okay? We are looking at that significant impact on progression into senior leadership for women. So first of all, that's the effect, but what is the cause? Well, if we also have a look, so Elizabeth made some really good points about that lack of flexible working and some really good examples. And the truth is, when we have a look at roles that are advertised as part-time, we can have a look, for example, kind of the general number that's thrown around is about like approximately 12% of roles that are advertised as part-time. However, and this is really crucial, if you think about the reasons why mothers are taking and being driven out of the workforce and taking those roles that are part-time, many of which, Elizabeth rightly said so, are lower quality and significantly less paid, but it's because there is a massive gap, okay? And it's not 12% of roles that are advertised as part-time. We have to break it down, because at the point in which we become mothers, many of us have 10 plus years of experience and multiple qualifications. So, for example, there's two things I'd like to look at. Number one, the as you move up, and if you have a look at managerial roles and director roles, the number of part-time roles significantly goes down. In addition to, there is a massive pay gap between part-time roles and full-time roles for equivalent positions. So let's imagine the same job in the same industry, there is still a pay gap just because it's part-time. So in general, it's £5 less per hour. But if you have a look at white-collar professional roles, it's more than £7 less per hour. So financially, it's less. but the reason, there are many reasons for that, but there is the lack of normalization of these roles. There is a simple, cause and effect, or that there is not just a gap here in the roles that are available. There is a chasm in the roles that are available. So we have very limited choices, because in terms of flexibility, what we really need, as again Elizabeth rightly said, for the majority of the cases, two parents are working. We are living in a cost of living crisis. For the most part, both parents have to work. And at the end of the day, childcare costs are extortionate, but also they're not necessarily there. And the last thing I'd like to say on this, to really talk about, we have to look at it also per industry. So if we look at per industry, it's even a sadder picture. So if we have a look at industry, so for example, in hospitality and services, by 32% are advertised as part-time. So this is according to Timewise Flexible Job Index. But let's break it down again to those professional roles. HR, financial accounting, 7%, IT, 3%, engineering, 2%. And actually, it gets even worse. That's not taking into account managerial positions. So a week before Christmas, I did a little search on LinkedIn just to see, okay, well, let's do a search of all of the jobs in the UK on LinkedIn. Let's make it hybrid and remote. We know, because we did a survey with over 2,500 parents in 64 countries, 99% of these parents need these roles. So I selected part-time, hybrid and remote, and I unselected the apprentice or entry level role. And it was 0.6%, according to my little calculations, 0.6% of roles were part-time. So I think we need to be really, really, really clear how lacking these roles are. And it's not just part-time roles. We know those roles exist in various different industries, but in the industries, and there is a choice there, but in the industry that so many of us want and need, it doesn't mean that we should have to delete our PhDs and multiple degrees and accept half, and that is the reality of the situation.
Yeah, so dumb down in order to get the job,
Yeah.
because you can't appear to be overqualified. And I mean, Liz, a lot of the things we talked about, there's an effect on salary, seniority, your pension pot. I was reading an article today, and again, it's an obvious thing, but the pension pot of all these women is massively impacted. So at the end of their working career, that's another issue. But what are from what you've seen, and you talk to a lot of women every day, what's the impact, other hidden impacts on them of this penalty?
I think the big one, I mean, obviously, as Emma's just said, people are competing for such a small percentage of jobs. So, and then, statistically, it's really hard then to get those jobs. So there's a lack of confidence. People's confidence really does drop, I think, when they're on maternity leave. Speaking actually from my experience, I was at work for a year while I was on maternity leave. And it felt like such a long time. Your life has completely changed. Your priorities have changed. Feels like everything's been turned upside down. You feel quite disconnected from work. You worry that you're not going to be able to pick it up. If you've had a longer career break, I know people really do fixate on career breaks. Because I do CV reviews as well, and people are like, really concerned about a career break they may have had like 10 years ago, because they're worried about the impression that will give to potential employers, that they're maybe not as committed, they're not as ambitious, etc. So I think there is a massive issue around confidence, imposter syndrome, particularly if people, like I said, have had a career break or maybe doing a pivot as well. Isolation as well, if people have stepped away from the workplace. Often work, gives people, a sense of purpose. It gives them a sense of identity. If they've stepped away from work, there's this, just a mum, and they feel that obviously contributes then to that lack of confidence. And then they're worried that they've lost skills as well, particularly in those industries that are really fast-paced, fast-moving. And I think there's that real worry that they will never re-enter the workplace as well, which obviously contributes to, mental health issues, etc. So there's a whole, non-financial aspect to this as well.
Yeah, which is massive in itself.
Yeah.
This is big, because if women are dealing with these, I mean, imposter syndrome is a big issue anyway for women. So that just exacerbating it doesn't help. I'm struck by something you said, and I saw that stat myself. Um, multiple reports, 44% of working mums earn less than they were earning prior to having children. And I think you're right that 10 years in itself is a bit of a smokescreen because it's probably longer and it anyway, but that's itself sounds like a long time. And the number taking up fairly junior admin roles in comparison to their qualification increased by 44%. So that might explain the 44% decrease in salary. So, why, Emma, do you see working mums taking on roles that they are overqualified for? I mean, you can probably talk from your personal experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, really, it does follow on from exactly what myself and Elizabeth have been saying. On one hand, you have that gap. So the choice is so limited, and I can talk from my own experience. And what Elizabeth said, it's so true. You're at a very pivotal point in your life where it is transformative. And you've got matrescence switch. As a biologist, it is a physiological and hormonal change. You've got that identity shift. And even having, so I also took 1 year, I say, out on top of my maternity leave, and it was just at the point in which I was changing career, and I was applying. So this is why I think I feel the pain so much, because I was in exactly that position, and I genuinely, and you can kind of probably see from my recent LinkedIn post that I've had a revelation, but I genuinely really forgot, like, I do have all of these skill sets, I do have these qualifications. It just happened that they were, pre-children, and you're so in the thick of becoming a parent, and also discovering, okay, well, what's going to work for my family, what's going to work for me. And generally that is what happens with mothers. We're the ones to take on that flexible role. We're the ones to, and that's because of essentially cultural norms that we have already ingrained in our, into our society. Um, and when I was looking for, and when you are, quite frankly, desperate for those roles because they're few and far between, I wanted to segue into a role that was not too dissimilar from my previous roles, kind of using a similar skill set. And I did remove my PhD from my CV. I did remove my managerial experience. And when you do that, you do feel like you're diminishing and forgetting kind of key parts of your identity, because they do become part of your identity. Like, you once a scientist, always a scientist. That's always there. You will always be a researcher. So it is definitely transformative in kind of, I think we can't forget that this is happening at a really pivotal point. And also, we haven't even spoken about kind of, and we're talking about the lack of roles and kind of the lack of progressions and taking on these roles, but we haven't even talked about the 74,000 women who are being fired and discriminated every year for this. And we also need to think about, there is also a motherhood penalty in terms of job quality, which is exactly as you're saying. So, so I know that there is research done by the King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership have shown that even without the salary aspect of it, there is a motherhood penalty in terms of that job quality. And again, it is linked to generally part-time jobs being of lower quality. And also, what do we mean by quality? We're talking about demands, autonomy, benefits, flexibility, and job security. Now, I was very lucky in kind of segueing into a career in which I had incredibly supportive line managers. I had best case scenario, block out your school runs. We trust you. You have autonomy. You can do this. And it's still a struggle and a juggle in between the school hours. So there is, and I mean, what's really key also is also retention of women. So we also know from the research that if you take more than a 6 month gap, and I feel that, I took that year gap, and Elizabeth is saying it does actually have a significant impact on career progression. So if you have that gap, if you're driven out of the workforce, if you take a role that is lower quality, that is going to impact retention. Whereas if you have an employer who recognizes and supports your skill set and qualifications, but enables you to work in a way that is right for you for this chapter, I'd like to emphasize this may not be forever. It may be, it may not, it may be for this chapter, that you will be able to stay in the workforce. And what happens when you stay in the workforce? You also progress in the workforce. I mean, if we have a look at some pretty dire statistics for women in STEM. So let's have a look at engineers. So female engineers, the average age of a woman leaving her engineering profession is 43 compared to a man who's 60. If we have a look at tech, for example, where we are going to have a huge skills crisis, 50% of women leave tech by the age of 35. And what happens when we are in our 30s? That is the time that we tend to progress and move to senior leadership positions. So if we do not support, and we can support in very different ways, but crucially, if we don't have those clear, transparent roles that really work for us, then we are not going to stay in the workforce.
Yeah, no, it's a real brain drain, basically, is what we're talking about. And the industries you've mentioned, there's so few women in the first place. And then losing any skilled, experienced people from that kind of those industries is only compounding things. Liz, if I could come to you, I mean, you talk to employers all the time, and with your experience, and you touched on the cost of childcare, and it's the third highest in the world, which blows my mind. And the average cost, I mean, I think is, I know that average figure of £285 for a child under two. I know a lot of people paying a lot more than that, so that's definitely an average. And so you're barely covering that, and then there's barely anything left. So, and taking into account this brain drain and this losing of really amazing skilled workforce at a particular time when they are just about coming into their own in their professional careers. What can employers look to do to kind of mitigate that? I mean, it falls down to a financial burden on working parents, but there's also an element that actually they can keep this great talent if they could crack how they can kind of support women going through this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all employers can, should, where they can, be able to offer flexible working. And, even if it's just letting people work from home a few days a week, so they maybe can pay an hour less for childminder, that would actually make such a big difference for so many people. Because if you're asking somebody in to an office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, you've got to factor in a commute, they're paying for a hell of a lot of childcare that they may actually not fully need, because they're paying for childcare for commuting time. So if you can offer some remote work, I know not all roles can offer that, then that actually will really decrease that childcare burden on individuals. But yeah, there was obviously Zurich was one of the first, well, was the first employer in the UK in 2019 to offer all roles as open to flexible, high and part-time work. And they massively increased the number of women they hired, all levels within the organization, but particularly at senior management level as well. And it's something that they've kept on doing. They've kept it on year on year, because they saw just how much of a success it was in closing the gender pay gap within their own organizations. I think another thing that employers can do that's not just about like the flexible working, but is that parental support. So I know that I was felt really daunted and frightened going back to work after maternity leave. And I know it would have hugely helped me to have had like a mentor or someone that had maybe been through it in the workplace that I could have had bounced ideas off. As a recruiter, I implemented a mentorship scheme for new starters, and it would have been brilliant to have that for returners as well. And speaking to people that have progressed actually within their career and are now really senior, a lot of them are CEOs, COOs, they credit when they went back having a really supportive manager that they could have an open dialogue with, but also having a coach. And the amount of women that I've spoken to that have really credited that the reason that they stayed at that employer, maybe when they were having a little bit of wobble, was because that employer invested in a coach for them. And how how worthwhile is that? That's not, for a big employer, if you're then retaining somebody with their skills, experience, that couple of £1,000 you might spend on a 6 month 3 months 6 months worth of coaching is well worth it, and a hell of a lot cheaper than paying for recruitment fees, training fees, etc., hiring somebody new as well. And I think another thing to employers should be avoiding is that presenteeism culture, rewarding output, not hours, because I think there's this assumption if someone sat on their desk, they're working. But, I can tell you this from experience, they're not always working. They might be scrolling the Daily Mail, checking the football, hop into the kitchen for a gossip. But I know that, if you're part-time or flexible, if you've got a deadline, you are working because you've got to meet that deadline. And that deadline for a lot of parents is a school pickup or a nursery pickup. And yeah, I mean, and a small employer myself, it doesn't have to cost anything. A lot of this stuff, obviously the coaching is a bit of an investment, but the flexibility doesn't have to cost anything. Getting rid of that presenteeism culture doesn't have to cost anything. Being a supportive manager doesn't have to cost anything. And I think as well, it really helps on job adverts. If you can offer flexibility, don't just put something really vague, like we're open to flexible working. Actually really specify it as well, because parents then will feel welcome and included to apply. They'll think, actually, that is somewhere that I am going to be, I'm going to be welcome.
Yeah. That makes complete sense. And I think you're right. For the smaller organizations that have a lot of financial burden at the moment, there are things that organizations can do. It's not all about throwing money at the problem. That mentoring is definitely worth considering. And I mean, we've touched, obviously, the motherhood penalty is really that a key driver for the gender pay gap. But I looked at that a 2019 government report and how far women have to downgrade their careers after having children. And one thing really struck me is that women working for the same employer in that report were more likely to remain at the same level, same career trajectory, and almost the same earnings. So it's like they stalled or they downgraded. Whereas women who moved organizations after having children tended to progress in greater numbers. So Liz, have you got a sense of what's driving that?
Well, yeah, because obviously as a recruiter, you'll know this, Claire, the best time to get a pay rise is when you move jobs.
Yeah.
And as a recruiter, I see it all the time. I see people, whether they're part-time or not, if they've stayed at the same employer for, a significant amount of time, they are predominantly, in the vast majority of cases, underpaid, because the employer is getting away with just paying, maybe inflation related pay rises every year, if that. So they're getting really minimal. You're getting really minimal pay rises if you stay with the same employer. But if you move, you can often get like a 10 grand pay increase. So you're actually, there is an incentive to move about. But if there obviously isn't many roles, if, like Emma said, 1% of roles, I think it was 1% for engineering, offer flexible working, there is no opportunity for you to get these big pay rises by looking on an external market. So that is why, women's salaries, if they stay with that employer, stagnate. And a lot of women are forced to stay with their same employer, not because they necessarily want to, but because there's a lack of options elsewhere.
Yeah, and it's almost, there's so much else going on, as you've mentioned, Emma. It's such a challenging time outside of work. It's not being able to find that alternative. And Emma, you've touched on this. We've mentioned it, this real brain drain, this loss of talent of working mums when they're hitting probably the kind of beginning to be the kind of zenith of their career, and they're at their most productive and most expert a lot of the time on what they do. So I've mentioned almost a fifth exit work altogether, and that apparently is only estimated to cost, that alone, £35 billion per year. That's clearly, there's no estimate for the 44% who are taking a downgrade. So there's a loss in terms of GDP from those individuals. So this is just the portion that feel like they've got no alternative, they can't cover the cost. So do you see an awareness of this issue? Because you're in STEM, Emma, and there is hopefully a little bit more awareness in STEM that there's a skill shortage anyway, and most employers will try and look at other things they can do to get the talent. Do you see an awareness of this issue?
So the simple answer is no. No, I would say there is some awareness, but at the end of the day, the employer wants the best person for that job. And I think there is a lack of awareness, because if there was an awareness, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are now. And if there was an awareness that this would have an incredible boost to the economy, that this would, we're not going to have this brain drain, that we are going to, like Elizabeth does, invest in women, and we're going to do it by supporting them structurally in a way that they really need. But I think sometimes when the problem is too big, that we're not going to focus on the problem, and we're just going to focus at the end of the day on our own business needs. But what I think it's not more important than the economy, but if you think about it from a business angle, it is good for business. This is not just good for parents, this is good for the business. And we have to be thinking about how roles are changing from an employer level and from a parent level. We have to understand. So when you said earlier, more parents are going for those admin roles, a similar kind of trend is happening in tech, in which a larger proportion of women are in those roles that are going to be more redundant. Those roles that are faster growing, for example, in cloud and DevOps, actually there's a much smaller proportion of women. So where things are changing so quickly, there absolutely is a lack of awareness for employers for many things. And like you were saying, that report that you were talking about, that government research, there is a lack of awareness. And I think everybody needs to know this, in that employment pathways, we kind of know this anecdotally and from our own experiences, but there's this graph that I'm absolutely obsessed with, because it absolutely describes my story, my situation. And essentially, when so a man becomes a dad, he's in full-time employment and he stays in full-time employment. It's all pretty much straightforward, nice clear graph. Whereas when a woman becomes a mother, essentially it becomes all really squiggly and all over the place. And the majority of women do not return to full-time work. So why is it that the majority of roles are still advertised as full-time? And like Elizabeth said, like, you are going to get a pay rise, that's when you are going to progress. So a lot of these women in these flexible roles, that works for them, may not necessarily be able to progress. And there is currently a problem with part-time culture, and there is a significant impact on the progression in part-time. And many of those women feel stuck, and that they can't move to another place because those other roles are being offered. And many of the flexible working requests do get rejected. So in answer to the impact on the economy, I would say, so all of these there are dots there, and we are joining the dots because we can see it on a daily basis. And I think they may vaguely know in abstract terms that it would impact, but I think if they knew the true impact, I think, for their business and getting those incredible skills into their organizations, I think personally I think it would be even more impactful if businesses knew that, rather than the impact on the economy, because that's going to impact them directly.
Yeah.
As will the economy. But I think it's more of this is a benefit for me and my business.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I'd like to talk about dads, because clearly dads, or the other partner, has a big part to play, or should. Actually, there were not as many reports as I'd like around that. So good to see some starting to come out. And one of them was the Millennium Dad, a Deloitte report in 2019. I think we've mentioned this, almost 3/4, 74% of families then said they needed two working parents. I would have thought that might have gone up now to survive financially. In that report, actually, millennium, I can barely say that word, but that generation, 87% of the dads say that they get involved in day-to-day childcare responsibilities, which everyone would applaud. But even they were saying in that report, they experienced tension from employers for leaving on time. And that was about a third of them said that. And 45% said they experienced tension just when trying to balance their work life when becoming a new parent. So, Liz, what's the impact on that? If, even dads who want to be supportive, who want to do their part, who want to leave on time so they can be there for pickups, are starting to feel that. What's the kind of negative effect that that might have?
I think there is a huge stigma and assumption that women are, still doing or should still do. A lot of employers think that women should still do more, women's work, childcare, etc. So I saw something on Motherhood, who's a huge advocate for flexible working on Instagram, and she shared a story about a dad that put in a flexible working request that they could I think do nursery pickup that was turned down, and their employer said, "Oh, why can't your wife do it?" And he was like, "Because my wife's a brain surgeon." So there's just like this massive assumption that it's, women should be working flexibly and doing the bulk of the childcare, even, and that even, with dads that want to do it. I think, my husband and I, we really do, try and share the pickups, etc. And I think, we talk about the juggle, but actually there's a juggle, we're all juggling, you know, cost of living has forced so many families into, both um, parents working, and it's difficult. And I think there has to be a recognition that it's difficult for both men and women. And, we're both likely, both could suffer from burnout, mental health issues, etc. Particularly if those employers for both parents aren't supportive. That, we've grown up in an era where women have been told we can do anything. We want to work in so many cases. We want, we don't want to necessarily do it all, but we want to, achieve our full potential. And therefore, dads really need to step up. And those dads that are stepping up need to be supported to do that.
Yeah, because, if they're willing and they get that tension and pushback, they're then less likely to want to
Yeah.
do it. They're going
And
to feel
it just
the negative
perpetuates the
effect,
cycle. So then the mum takes on more, the penalty deepens,
and then
and
it
yeah, it's
goes
just a vicious
so
cycle and it
close.
keeps going and going.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And Emma, another element in terms of the dad or the other partner, in terms of when a working mom wants to return to the workplace, is shared parental leave. It's been around for about 12 years now. But I saw a 2023 report by the Dad Shift, and that said fewer than 2% of new fathers had actually benefited or taken up really shared parental leave. And this one, I think when I saw it, I thought, yeah, of course, that's the case. 60% of shared parental leave goes to the UK's top earners. So essentially, it's only those, and I think the stat was earning 50K and above, those earners felt comfortable taking shared parental leave. But clearly, dads earning less than that aren't taking it up, and that's 12 years on. So why do you think the uptake is so low?
So what we need to do is we need to look at case studies in countries in which there is a fantastic uptake. And if we have a look at the country which has the highest uptake in the world, which is 90% of the parental leave, and it also just so happens to be the country which has the smallest gender pay gap in the world. And you might be able to guess from a handful of countries, it is Iceland. And the great thing about Iceland is that they've been doing this for 25 years. So we've got data on this and we know that the impact on this, and there's some really interesting benefits, for example, decreased divorce rates shortly after the shared parental leave was introduced. But if we have a look, there is some really, really key things that Iceland are doing that are going well, and things that are not going as well, and we can learn from. So the things that are going well is that 25 years ago, they introduced quotas. So they have a use it or lose it. So they introduced a three for the mum, 3 for the dad, and 3 that they can flex between both partners. But what is really crucial is that it's 80% of their pay and until a certain cap. And they found that there was a huge increase. So there's essentially 90% uptake of dads for this parental leave. So it was going really well. They recently revised it in 2021 to do a 6 months for the mum, 6 months for the dad, and a 6 weeks flex. Now, where it's going well. So if we want to get more dads to take up parental leave, we would need to introduce it has to be well paid. And I think that, that reflects from those higher earners who is taking it, because we can't afford to do any less. So it has to be well paid. It has to be simple. Have you ever tried to get shared parental leave? My goodness, you need a degree in law. It is so complicated. So it has to be simple. There needs to be quotas in place. It needs to be well paid. But what Iceland also found is that there is still a big discrepancy, although there's a high uptake, there's a massive discrepancy in the number of days that the mother takes compared to the father. So almost 3 times as many days. And also they find that there are still a stigma in the workplace, although, managers can, encourage those fathers to take it. There is still, even though it's become more normalized, there's still kind of that cultural conversation and stigma that we need to have with dads to be able to do this. So I would say there's definitely lessons that we can learn from Iceland, but what is really clear, keep it simple, keep it well paid, have those quotas. And finally, what is really interesting is that the dads in Iceland tend to take it in a more flexible way. So they would tag it on to summer holidays and Christmas breaks. Now, this coincides really interestingly that it doesn't have an effect on their career progression. So remember, I said before, there's research that shows that if you take more than 6 months of a break, it is going to have a significant impact on your career progression, but it doesn't affect the dads. So we can do it in a way. We can have those really simple changes. And I do think that would have a dramatic effect on the uptake of parental leave.
So tagging it on flexibly at different points of the year rather than a really long break. Yeah, neither one is going to then be as impacted career-wise. Yeah, that makes sense, Emma. And Emma, just in terms of, you've touched on this, but more and more, and I think some of the stats we've mentioned, there's clear reasons why more and more working mums are setting up their own businesses, their own initiatives, because they can't find the kind of work they want to do out there. So like the 5-Hour Club you co-founded, which is to reimagine that 9 to 5 work day and help working parents maintain their work-life balance. So can you tell us a little bit more about it, Emma?
Yeah, no worries. So the 5-Hour Club is essentially a platform in which we help employers to shape roles that can be done in the school hours. So we verify every role that it's 25 hours or less, and that it is a professional role with the salary. So in addition to a platform, we also have a community and a podcast where we help to drive these conversations forward. So at the moment, we are encouraging parents on LinkedIn and socials in our campaign #ParentsBelong to share those stories, because that's where 5-Hour Club came about. It was by Amy sharing her story and us receiving so many messages from parents all around the world, and that we know how important it is to share our stories, that we do belong in the workplace, and that we do, that we are looking for these roles, and that they're so desperately needed. And then the last thing is that we are also working with coaches to help support parents. So there's lots going on at 5-Hour Club, but ultimately, we want to advocate and support those parents to really thrive and progress in their careers, in addition to being parents.
Yeah, so supporting both parents, which makes sense. And Liz, I think I mentioned you set up Investing in Women after yourself being made redundant in 2020. And I think, were you coming back from mat leave, or had you come
So
back?
I was one of those 74,000 people. I think when I was made redundant, it was 54,000. So it's very frightening that in 5 years' time, it's gone up by 20,000. So I was made redundant. From my part-time job, I'd managed to negotiate part-time after my first maternity leave, was due to come back after my second, and was told that I was, one of the only people in the team that I was being let go. And then, surprise, surprise, because there wasn't a lot of flexible roles at my level, couldn't find another part-time or flexible position at my skill set. And I could just see what had happened to so many of my friends, where they had to take something lower paid, lower skilled in exchange for that flex. And I look back on my own recruitment career. I'd been in recruitment, about 14 years at that point, and I had never ever recruited anybody on a part-time basis at that point. When I worked for one of the big recruitment agencies, we didn't even register people that wanted to work part-time. I don't know if that is still the case. And even working, one of the big four that, has a lot on their website and, makes a lot of noise about supporting flexible working. When it actually came to it, we did have one lady that requested part-time, that we made a job offer to, the answer was no. So I thought I wanted to use my recruitment experience to try and make a difference. That's why I set up Investing Women, which is a job board, recruitment company, and community that helps people find flexible part-time and home-based jobs that work around them and their lives.
And just as an aside, are you finding more employers are willing, happy, see the reason to engage and look at flexible talent?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, obviously, we've seen some employers that are rolling back on it. And I did a post about that on LinkedIn about a certain employer last week. But generally, yeah. And I also, as an employer myself, and speaking to other employers, there is so many benefits to employing people on a part-time and flexible basis. I did a podcast interview with a lady last week who is a huge, huge advocate of flexible working and part-time, and she employs, lots of people on part-time basis. And with the national insurance increase as well, it's really affected so many employers. But actually a way of, recruiting people, as we've talked about, there is a real lack of flexible part-time work. So if you can offer a part-time role, then you're much more likely you're going to get a brilliant, brilliant candidate for that position. And you're going to, you're going to be paying a part-time salary. You're going to be paying less in employment taxes and associated employment costs. I always think that productivity increases for those people that, are working shorter hours. If they're on a deadline, if they've got a school pickup, I know from my experience, I work flat out until 3 o'clock. So if you're, a company that wants to maybe boost your productivity, then part-time is a really good way to do that. Obviously, I'm not advocating giving someone 5 days worth of week work, squeezed into 4. Actually think about what's essential and what's not. I think it really does help to make an organization leaner and ultimately much more profitable as well. And you're going to get a much more diverse set of ideas as well. If you can employ, if you can advocate for flexible work, it's not just for mums, it's for people with, disabilities, people maybe with caring responsibilities. You can obviously, if you can offer remote, you can recruit throughout the country. You can, really recruit the best talent worldwide. So I think you're going to have a much more profitable and innovative organization if you do embrace this.
Yeah. And anything else, Emma, other than we've maybe mentioned that you think employers can be doing? I mean, you talked about the case study of Iceland, which is kind of a government initiative. But what else, anything else you think employers can do to kind of harness the untapped talent of working mums?
Yeah, I think there is a couple of, and again, really just simple things. So on I think Elizabeth referred to it earlier, but on a job advert, be as transparent as you can. And actually, even the small changes in the language really does make a difference. So if you can shape it as a part-time role, can you offer it as a 25-hour role a week? That would make a massive difference for so many people. Be really clear in your flexible but particularly with your hybrid and remote. We noticed that remote roles get through three times more applicants than hybrid roles even. But can you do it as a job share, for example? So if it's a full-time role, it's a full-time, there's an organization called the Job Share Revolution, and they showcase incredible stories, and people at senior level doing it as a job share. And there's so many benefits, like Elizabeth said, like productivity and problem solving, 2 brains for the one. Now I know that's a little bit more challenging than shaping it on a job post. Also, please be aware of the structural biases that part-time employees have. So the current part-time culture, it does have an impact on career progression. So helping that parent or that employee really belong in that organization and support their progression. Also be aware of those huge biases in terms of the pay gap between full-time and part-time, even for the same role. We had a recent instance in which an employer wanted to advertise a job for us. It was part-time digital marketing lead, which according to Glassdoor has an average salary of 64,000. They were looking for 5+ years experience, but they wanted to advertise it as minimum wage because they said we're going to start with part part-time and then move on from there. So you have to be aware and think of it in terms of deliverables, output over hours, what can be achieved, because again, research has shown, I need to dig out this research, but there is research to show that actually the most productive group of employees are mothers with two children. So be aware of the biases, be transparent. Can you do the job share, and make sure to support progression, and even very, very simple things, having that conversation, which is what my line manager did back in the day. She said, block out your school run on your team's calendar. Scheduling, be intentional about when you're scheduling those meetings to make sure that we can do those school runs, so that, and modeling those really crucial boundaries that will enable, because at the end of the day, if you feel like you're trusted and you feel like you're belong, you're going to want to give back, just
Yeah. Yeah, you're more empowered and you'll give more to the job. Absolutely. And Emma, if you were going to give one key piece of advice, because working mums have agency as well, and it can feel like this is all very structural, and it's kind of like we've talked about a lot of fairly negative stuff on here today. But what would be a piece of advice that you give a working mum to try and minimize that impact of the working motherhood penalty on them individually?
So I appreciate that this bit of advice is for women in a partnership. But if you are in a partnership, to sit down and have that conversation with your partner and discuss, this is a family income. This is not just my income. Because I know the mentality of returning to work, you're thinking, oh, well, I'm just going to be able to pay for childcare. I'm not going to be earning anything more than that. Well, that's not the reality. So in the long term, you need to think about your pension. Are you then going to split your pension? So I think in terms of that career progression, knowing that there are these massive obstacles and barriers in place, think of it as a long term, and think of it as a family collective instead of your individual income.
Great, thank you, Emma. I'm just going to mention some comments we've got. We've had a comment: recruitment agencies are not interested in part-time because there's less income in it for them. And often, I think from my experience, they see less roles come through. But we've already talked, there are organisations out there. We're going to share information on investing in women and the 5-hour club, so you can reach out and join those communities and get involved. And another comment: all for flex and part-time work, but concerned about the intensification of work. So roles that are offered 4 or 5, well, I presume 4 days a week, they're essentially looking for you to do 5 days work, and of course that's not feasible. And I think, again, you have agency in pushing back on that. I know that can be difficult, but yeah, that clearly you don't want that. That can't be creeping into the role. Liz, if I could come to you, I mean, a lot of what we talked about is fairly negative and some depressing stats. So I'd like to finish on a more positive note and a more hopeful note. So what reasons do you have to feel cheerful about the future in terms of, the future for working mums in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually quite positive about the future of work generally. I think, 10 years ago, I don't think this was even talked about, flexible working. They're definitely, and there's been so much noise over the past, 8, 9 years by some brilliant people, on and offline. But like Jolie Brearley has done so much through Pregnant and Screwed, obviously Anna Whitehouse as well through Motherhood. And I think that just hearing those conversations has empowered so many other women to actually, talk about what they need, what they want from work. Flexible work is becoming much more mainstream. We've had, 4-day work week trial, remote work has become, the norm, as has hybrid work. Pre-pandemic, everyone would have been in full-time was 5 days a week in an office. Now, in the vast majority of cases, full-time is hybrid, 3 days in an office, 2 days from home, which is a game changer for so many people. And it enables people, to maintain their salary, to maintain their seniority level. And actually, in a lot of cases, is about, is the flex that they need. I'm not obviously for everybody, but for a lot of people, they're really happy with that hybrid work environment. Obviously, job sharing as well has become much more mainstream. Job Share Revolution is talking a lot about job sharing. Employers are listening. obviously through Investing Women, 5 Hour Club, there's other recruitment platforms out there that are also thriving, that advertise flexible roles. So there is, showing that there is a demand for family-friendly talent. And I think employers are recognizing just how good that talent is as well. And I think also what's really, really promising, and Emma touched on it, is the number of women that actually set up their own businesses. And I know a lot of women are forced to doing that, and it's definitely not an easy route, but we have worked, and these are often my favorite businesses, with so many female-owned businesses that were founded a similar time to Investing in Women because that individual couldn't get flexibility at work. They are now becoming employers. They are offering those jobs that they couldn't get themselves. They are reaping the benefits of hiring talent, that are looking for that flexible positions. And I think that actually, the route to wealth in so many cases is through business ownership. And the more women that have that wealth, if we can transfer that wealth from men who, statistically hold most of the wealth across the world into the hands of women, that is going to be just transformative for the whole world. And that is where the real impact, the long-term impact is going to be. So actually, I know a lot of women are forced into entrepreneurship, not always an easy route, but actually long-term, it will, I think, be brilliant for so many people as well.
Yeah, that's a very nice positive place to end. And that great shining a light on that female entrepreneurship. I agree completely. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank everyone who took time out of their day to join us. I hope you found the session as insightful as I did. I think we could talk a lot longer, but a very, very big thank you to my two wonderful guests this morning. Thank you to Liz and thank you, Emma, for sharing your experiences, your time, and your expertise so generously with us all today. Just a reminder, we will share a recording of the session, plus information on how you can reach out to and contact both Liz and Emma, and we'll try and put in some links to some of the reports we've mentioned, which you may find interesting, and that will all come out in the next 24 hours. But thank you all and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.